Fosseism, the practice of capitalizing on fear, sex, limited ballet turnout, and hard work. Bob Fosse accumulated several titles during his career. Referred to as an extraordinarily talented actor, director, dancer, choreographer, Bob also wrote. Not all his critics loved him. He longed for a good review from the New York Times. In Fosse films and stage musicals, nothing wins over an audience like a loser. Bob often pictured himself as a loser. When successful, he felt pressured to top his success. His drive to succeed, a fear of failure, brought out the best of Bob Fosse. In choreography, Bob excelled. Several of his physical limitations showed in the Fosse dance style. Hunched shoulders, hats, and knocked knees revealed his posture. Balding and limited turnout. Limitations asset Fosse's work. His struggle brings excellence to audiences on stage and film. I first recognized Fosse's work in Dancin at Chicago's Shubert Theatre. I felt Fosse produced the show for me. Alone in Chicago, compliments of Uncle Sam, I rode the train in for my U.S. Air Force entrance physical. I registered at a hotel they put me up in. Some military morons reiterated the time and location for the physical. After filling out a stack of paperwork, they strictly instructed me to return before the 10 o'clock curfew. Left to explore Chicago, I stalked the empty sidewalks. The streets glistened, washed clean from earlier rain. The dim street lights reflected off the pavement. An occasional taxi passed by. Otherwise, the area lay dead. A lone Shubert Theatre sign glowed on the distant corner of West Monroe. Attracted like a bug, I approached the unassuming building in a somewhat sleazy district. The theater looked like a live strip joint. A chest-high sign with a picture of a long-haired lady leaning back in ecstasy, a man glaring down above her, in a tux and a bowler hat, and sexy legs protruding from all angles. Boasted with reviews and citing its Tony Awards, I purchased a $15 ticket. I bought my way to heaven. The long climb through purgatory exhausted me. I sat high above, on a lonely cloud, peering down on the elite. Far from the stage, I stared through the tunnel-like darkness onto the spot-lit Mr. Bojangles. Focusing on the mood, finally relaxed in my seat, I saw my life moving to a new stage. A single tear rolled down my cheek. The performance of Mr. Bojangles and his spirit in Recollections of an Old Dancer symbolized a new stage of his life. With my emotions heightened, the show triggered a wave of response. From tears to laughter, my heart poured out to Dancin. The amusing 14 feet nailed 7 dancers' wooden shoes to the stage, each head topped with little swirled boingies, white stripes painted on their arms to their legs down. Black costumes with white gloves looked ridiculously funny. Bob's creative choreographic humor displayed itself in the strange shapes, movement, and patterns of silly creatures from another world dancing to Was Dog a Donut. Pieces like A Manic Depressive's Lament, Kevin Grubb writes, succeeded because most audience knew how glibly morose Fosse could be. It was part of his signature. America rekindled my patriotism with George M. Cohan's Yankee Doodle Dandy and John Philip Sousa's The Stars and Stripes Forever. Music ranged from Bach to Cat Stevens. Fosse offered a collage of dances, which gave something to most everyone. The powerhouse performance strained the dancers. The high number of listed alternatives reflects this. Keeping a constant eye on the time, I worried about returning before curfew. I wanted to stay till curtain call. I owed the dancers an ovation for a spectacular night, so I stayed. The night turned to a celebration of spirit, of rejoicing with the audience, each touched by Bob Fosse. I strolled back to the hotel, lost in the city and lost in euphoria. I happily danced in the street. I returned after 11, just before a room inspection. The next day's physical possessed some of Fosse's satiric humor and convoluted choreography. The military exercise went off without a hitch. A sergeant commandedly marched 20 men and I into a room with 2 female doctors. He lined us up in a tight U formation. In a deep voice, he said, "You will follow my instructions." In a well-practiced and structured form, he ordered each meticulous step of undressing, with our clothes neatly at our sides and our bodies erect in attention. The doctors fondled our testicles with plastic gloves. They inspected us closely. The sergeant told each recruit to cough. The doctors said nothing. They executed the procedure with precision. Each doctor finished each man at the same time. The rhythm amazed me. To the order of "About face," we turned. "Bend down and grab your ankles," shouted the sergeant, facing the recruit across from me. We shared a disheartened look. "Now, with your head down, slowly bring your hands up to your cheeks," the sergeant barked. Climaxing, he commanded, "Grab them firmly. Now, spread 'em." In this position, it sunk in what came next. The Air Force, unfortunately, accepted me. In Fosse's later work, Kevin Grubb summarizes theater critics' consensus with Frank Rich's New York Times review of Big Deal. With "Beat Me Daddy, 8 to the Bar," Mr. Fosse makes an audience remember what is, and has been, missing from virtually every other musical in town: the dizzying sense of levitation that Mr. Fosse achieves in this dance is one of those unquantifiable elements that defined the Broadway musical when it was a going concern. The disappointment of Big Deal is that even Mr. Fosse, one of the form's last great magicians, can conjure up that joy so rarely. Given that Mr. Fosse had staged some of Broadway's funniest musicals, it's hard to understand how the book of Big Deal grew to become ponderous and cheerless. Fosse's commercial success in Dancin versus the failure of Big Deal I attributed partly to the introduction of a story. Accordingly to Time, Fosse personally raked in approximately $28,000 a day at some points of Dancin's 1,774 productions. Disappointed it won only one Tony Award for choreography and with poor critical reviews, Big Deal closed after a meager 70 shows. Before Fosse's death, he reportedly started working on Dancin's sequel. Dancin 2 died with its master. I would suggest to Bob, if he wasn't dead, a possible sequel to 14 Feet. Collaborating with a sergeant I met, he might create a wonderful piece titled 21 Sphincters. Kevin Grubb captures the feelings of Fosse's devotees when he writes of Big Deal's final performance. Big Deal's last performance, June 8th, brimmed with memorable moments that came from the knowledge of that tomorrow the stage of the Broadway theater would be wiped clean of any trace of Fosse's musical. In the audience were Gwen Verdon and Nicole Fosse, torchbearers of the Fosse's legacy, a twinkling galaxy of thespians, many former Fosse dancers, and those hard-bitten Fosse fans who refused to believe Big Deal was on its deathbed. In fact, throughout the performance, they did their best to resuscitate it with wild bursts of applause and standing ovations. At the conclusion of the one-act showstopper, Beat Me Daddy, 8 to the Bar, they stood and applauded for nearly 3 minutes, temporarily halting the show as the dancers tearfully embraced one another like triumphant runners taking their victory lap. A cry rang out, "One more time!" which was quickly picked up as a chant in the audience. When the curtain finally came down on the show, one felt an immense sense of loss and looked for someone nearby to console. As they left, theater goers were strangely subdued, almost funeral. A young man with tears streaming down his face placed a single, long stem rose on the stage apron. As I tearfully read this, I reminisce of the joy Fosse brings and the pain in his loss. Bob's dance style distinguished itself. Bob always used to say he only had 10 steps. Dance Captain Pettifor explains, he just kept evolving. Then, according to the nature of the show, film critics Vince Canby mistakenly implies Fosse's style is taken from Hermes Pan. Bob Fosse, featured in an expert from Kiss Me Kate, was dancing dances then choreographed by Hermes Pan that looked very much like the dances that Fosse has more recently been choreographing for Sweet Charity, The Little Prince, in Chicago. Inspired by Fosse, Canby later retracts the comment. Note, Bob Fosse, the director, actor, dancer, and choreographer, has written to say that one of the reasons the choreography in a scene from Kiss Me Kate, included in That's Entertainment Part 2, which I identified it as looking like Fosse's later choreography, is that he choreographed it, not as I wrote, Hermes Pan, which makes sense. The tone of Canby's retraction appears self-centered, nevertheless. It points out Fosse's 1953 choreographic style looks to a critic similar to later work. Sheridan Morley writes of Fosse, he created from Pajama Game in 1954 almost 30 years, across 30 years to Dancin', by way of Damn Yankees and Redhead in Chicago, and above all, Sweet Charity. a look that was quintessentially and uniquely his. That angular, bent-limbed, leggy look of dancers who seemed to be all elbows and kneecaps and ankles. She continued, even if you had never heard a note of the score or a word of the dialogue, you knew at once that it was a Fosse show. By the first glimpse of the dancing, it was Fosse alone who tore the American stage musical away from the ballroom and the bandstand, only to relocate it in the gymnasium. Fosse alone who first established the on-stage supremacy of the choreographer. Morley, a London critic, received Fosse better than most New York critics. Generally, most London critics took to Fosse's style. Morley goes on, in that sense, he more than anyone else in New York or London reinvented the musical during the middle 50s. The second half of Pajama Game was decades before Cats or Chorus Line. The first time that someone had the courage to throw away the plot and go for the look and the feel and the sensation of the show, in which the characters really didn't matter a damn, and from there on he was to work most often and successfully in a partnership with the dancer Gwen Verdon, whom he once married and who came to represent.
Your hats, folks, for the hair-raising first act finale of Big Deal, Beat Me Daddy, 8 to the bar. First act finale of Big Deal, Beat Me Daddy, 8 to the bar.
Since it is for choreography and the whole show of dances, I'd like to name them all, but I'll save you that more. I would like to name Cleavon Derricks and Alan Weekston, the wonderful Loretta Devine, and hope that does it for everybody. I thank you very much. You've made me very, very happy.